He called himself the King of Kings. He once lived in golden tents, traveled with female bodyguards, and threatened to turn Africa into a nuclear empire. But in the end, he was dragged from a sewage pipe, bleeding, begging, beaten by his own people while the cameras rolled. This is the story of the brutal last hours of Muammar Gaddafi, and why his fall was far more disturbing than the world was ever prepared to admit. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The fall of the King of Kings. For over 4 decades, Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya like a desert pharaoh. He seized power in 1969 as a 27-year-old army officer and overthrew the monarchy without firing a shot. But what came next was anything but peaceful. Gaddafi was a man of contradictions, a brutal dictator who called himself a revolutionary, a champion of African unity who ordered political executions televised on state TV. He was obsessed with power, legacy, and paranoia. He didn't trust anyone, not even his own children, said one of his former ministers, years later in exile. His enemies disappeared. His critics were tortured. And those who crossed him often ended up dead in the desert, left as a warning. And yet, Gaddafi wasn't just feared. He was courted. Because Libya was rich, very rich, in oil. Billions flowed into Gaddafi's hands, and with that, he began to reshape the country into something strange. A dictator's playground. He refused to live in palaces. Instead, he built luxurious Bedouin-style tents in the middle of the desert and in the middle of capital cities. Wherever he traveled, Paris, Rome, even New York, a golden tent was pitched near his hotel. He surrounded himself with female bodyguards in designer uniforms, claiming they were virgins who'd sworn loyalty unto death. He thought it made him untouchable, said one defector. A king in his own fantasy. He wrote bizarre political treatises, referred to himself as brother leader, and demanded to be called the King of Kings of Africa. Western leaders smiled for the cameras, shook his hand, even called him a partner in peace. But behind the scenes, they watched nervously. Because Gaddafi didn't just want power. He wanted revenge. A legacy of blood. He funded rebel movements across Africa and the Middle East. He funneled cash and weapons to terrorist groups, including the ones behind deadly bombings in Europe. Most infamously, in 1988, a Pan Am passenger plane exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 270 people. The world blamed Libya. Sanctions followed. Embassies closed. Gaddafi's grip on power seemed shaky. But he survived. Again and again. Until the Arab Spring came. 2011. The fire reaches Libya. It started in Tunisia. Then Egypt. Then Syria. People were rising up, against corrupt regimes, against kings, against fear. And in February 2011, Libya ignited. Protests broke out in Benghazi. Ordinary citizens, young, unarmed, took to the streets. They wanted jobs, dignity, a future. Gaddafi's response? He called them rats. And then, he ordered airstrikes on civilian crowds. The world watched in horror. Cities began to fall into rebellion. Gaddafi's empire was crumbling, city by city. But still, he swore he would never run, never hide. I will die a martyr, he told the world on state television. Libya is mine. But the world had other plans. Hunted like an animal. By mid-2011, Gaddafi was no longer a ruler. He was a fugitive. The once feared dictator who hosted presidents, shook hands with royalty, and dined with diplomats, was now a wanted man. His capital, Tripoli, had fallen. His military was fractured. His once loyal ministers were defecting. But Gaddafi, he refused to flee. He could have escaped to Venezuela, to South Africa, even to Syria, one intelligence source said. But he was too proud. He believed Libya would rise back for him. So instead of disappearing, Gaddafi vanished into his hometown, Sirte, a coastal city on the edge of the Mediterranean. He took his most loyal fighters, a few family members, and what was left of his fortune. And for weeks, he moved like prey. Life on the run. Reports later revealed the shocking reality of Gaddafi's final days in hiding. He slept on the roofs of abandoned homes, constantly changing location. Ate from tin cans, drank boiled river water, and bathed with bottled Coca-Cola. No phone calls, no internet. He was afraid of drones tracking his voice. He wrote a final will by hand, asking to be buried in his hometown, not sold out like Saddam. Libya's new rebel government was closing in. But it wasn't just them. NATO was watching. American, British, and French drones circled overhead. Satellite intel tracked every convoy leaving Sirte. They were looking for a pattern. And on October 20, 2011, they found one. The convoy that wasn't supposed to be seen. That morning, Gaddafi and about 50 loyalists decided to make a break for it. They loaded into a convoy of cars, armed but disguised. But the sky above was not empty. A U.S. Predator drone, flown by American operators in Nevada, followed them silently. Then came the signal. 2 French fighter jets and a NATO warplane fired multiple missiles. Explosions tore through the desert road. Smoke filled the air. Gaddafi's convoy was decimated. Some were killed instantly. Others ran for cover. Gaddafi. He survived, barely. Wounded, dazed. And now, he was trapped. He scrambled into a concrete drainage pipe with his bodyguards. No backup was coming. No helicopters. No secret escape. Just silence. Hiding underground. It was a storm drain, a filthy, narrow culvert barely big enough to lie down in. Flies buzzed. The smell of death lingered from earlier battles nearby. The King of Kings was now crouched in sewage, blood on his face, trembling. He held a golden pistol. Still believed he could talk his way out. But what came next was the last thing he ever saw. Trapped in a drainage pipe. Sirte, Libya. October 20, 2011. The sun was rising. Smoke from NATO's airstrike still lingered in the air. And deep beneath a battered highway, inside a filthy storm drain, the once mighty Muammar Gaddafi huddled in the dark. The man who once controlled a country the size of Alaska, who lectured world leaders, paraded in golden robes, and styled himself after Roman emperors, now sat bleeding in the dirt. His hair was matted. His bodyguards, some dead, some dying, whispered prayers. And outside, the mob was closing in. There's someone in the pipe. A group of Libyan rebel fighters, armed with AK-47s and smartphones, scanned the wreckage of the convoy. Then someone shouted, "He's here! He's hiding in the pipe!" The fighters rushed forward, some 18 years old, some wearing sandals and football jerseys. Young men who had grown up under Gaddafi's regime and now held the power of justice or vengeance. They approached the culvert cautiously, guns drawn, fingers shaking. And then, they saw him. The footage begins rolling. What happened next was captured on a grainy cell phone camera. Shaky, chaotic, horrifying. It would soon circle the globe. A rebel reaches into the pipe. Another grabs Gaddafi's arm. He's dragged out, barely able to stand. Blood covers the side of his head. He's dazed, gasping. The man who once threatened to crush dissent with iron and fire now pleads for mercy. "Don't shoot," he yells. "What did I do to you? My sons. Where are my sons?" He tries to speak, maybe to negotiate, maybe to explain. But no one's listening. Chaos erupts. The crowd erupts. Some cheer. Some scream. Some curse him, spitting on him, slapping his head. Others shout, "Keep him alive. Don't kill him here." But the fury had reached a boiling point. This wasn't a courtroom. There were no judges. Only rage. One rebel struck him with a shoe, a grave insult in Arab culture. Another pulled his hair. And then came the blows. Gaddafi was beaten, kicked, violated. Someone pulled a pistol. Shots rang out. Blood poured from his stomach, chest, and head. And still, he whispered, "This is wrong. Haram, this is wrong." A death without dignity. He died on the hood of a rebel truck, half-naked, blood-soaked, and surrounded by cheering fighters holding up smartphones like trophies. There was no trial. No last words in court. No moment to explain, to confess, or to deny. Just chaos. And then silence. The world watches in horror. Within hours, the footage was online. It spread like wildfire, across Twitter, Facebook, TV stations. Some celebrated. Others recoiled. "This isn't justice," one human rights official said. "It's lynching. It's vengeance." The UN called for an investigation. NATO shrugged and said it had no role in his capture. And the Arab world? Divided. Some called it divine punishment. Others, especially elders, called it shameful. "Even tyrants deserve a death with dignity," one Libyan elder said. This was not our way. Mob justice, filmed for the world. The footage of Gaddafi's death didn't just capture the moment he died. It revealed something far more disturbing. A crowd of ordinary people erupting into primal fury, and the line between justice and revenge vanishing in real time. There were no official uniforms, no court orders, no Geneva Convention protections. Just rage, spilling over into violence, as a dictator who once terrified the nation became a trophy in the dirt. The video that couldn't be unseen. The video begins with screams. Gaddafi, bloodied and stunned, is dragged by his arms. He tries to speak, but a punch silences him. A voice yells in Arabic, "Hit him!" Another, "Don't shoot! Not yet!" But moments later, gunshots. The phone camera shakes, cuts out, then returns to show Gaddafi crumpled, bleeding. And then comes the most shocking frame. A rebel fighter brandishing a knife, one arm raised. And Gaddafi screaming in pain. The world would later learn, he was not just beaten or shot. He was sexually violated with a bayonet. The footage blurred by international media didn't hide the truth. Those who saw it never forgot. Silence from the West. The world had cheered when Gaddafi's regime fell. But now, suddenly, leaders went quiet. Barack Obama appeared before reporters, smiling, calling it a momentous day. Nicolas Sarkozy, who had met with Gaddafi just years earlier, declared the Libyan people free. David Cameron called it a triumph of justice. But none mentioned how Gaddafi died. Because the world had just watched, in real time, a summary execution. A man brutalized to death on video. A dictator turned into a symbol of vengeance, not justice. Human rights organizations issued cautious statements, urging investigation. But there was no investigation. No war crimes trial. No accountability. Because too many powerful hands were dirty. A death that solved a problem. Some insiders would later claim that Gaddafi's death wasn't just a battlefield accident. It was politically convenient. He knew things. About Western oil deals, about terror financing, about European backdoor diplomacy. If he had lived, if he had spoken in a courtroom, secrets might have surfaced. Instead, he was silenced. And the world moved on. But Libya did not. The collapse begins. In the days after his death, Libya's streets filled with celebration. Cars honked. Men fired guns into the sky. Gaddafi's corpse was placed on public display, a grotesque spectacle. But beneath the cheers, a power vacuum opened. Militias began fighting each other for control. Islamic extremists flooded in. The weapons Gaddafi stockpiled were now loose across North Africa. The man was dead. But the system he built, and the chaos he left behind, had just begun to explode. The footage the West wanted buried. The world had seen many dictators fall before. Saddam Hussein was hanged in a courtroom. Ceausescu of Romania was shot after a brief trial. But Gaddafi, his death was raw, lawless, and broadcast from a cell phone camera to millions within hours. And for Western powers, it was a public relations nightmare. The sanitized version. Western news channels blurred the worst parts of the footage. CNN aired only fragments. BBC refused to show the actual moment of death. Facebook and YouTube pulled the full videos within days. But the truth was already out. Gaddafi had been humiliated, tortured, and killed without trial, in part thanks to an airstrike coordinated by NATO. That raised a disturbing question. Was the West complicit in an extrajudicial killing? No NATO boots on the ground, or were there? In 2011, NATO had promised that its role in Libya would be limited to air support. No troops, no direct targeting. But leaked diplomatic cables and later testimony revealed otherwise. NATO drones and intelligence were used to track Gaddafi's convoy. French forces admitted dropping the first bombs. British SAS were reportedly embedded with Libyan rebels. And when the convoy was struck, and Gaddafi was wounded, no order was given to protect or capture him alive. Instead, the world stood back and let the mob take over. What was Gaddafi about to expose? Many believe Muammar Gaddafi knew too much. He had made secret deals with Western oil companies. He had funded rebel groups and intelligence operations around Africa and the Middle East. He allegedly had evidence of bribes and backroom alliances going back decades. In 2016, the French government was forced to open an inquiry into whether Sarkozy's 2007 presidential campaign was secretly funded by Gaddafi himself. And documents found after Gaddafi's death appeared to support that claim. If Gaddafi had lived, if he had stood trial, he might have taken a few Western leaders down with him. But now, those secrets were buried in a shallow desert grave. The UN's quiet disappointment. The United Nations called for an investigation. They wanted answers. Who pulled the trigger? Why wasn't Gaddafi captured? What rules of war had been violated? But no action was taken. No tribunal. No charges. Just silence. Because no country wanted to admit what had really happened. A dictator had been lynched, not by rebels, but on the world's watch. The ghost of Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi's body was buried in a secret location. No tomb. No marker. No place for mourners, or for followers. We don't want anyone to turn his grave into a shrine, one rebel commander said. Or into a target. But even underground, Gaddafi refused to disappear. Because within months of his death, Libya began to fall apart. Libya, the country he left in ruins. Without Gaddafi's iron grip, the power vacuum exploded. Militias, armed to the teeth with weapons from his old stockpiles, began carving up the country. Tripoli was ruled by one faction. Benghazi by another. Extremist groups, including ISIS, moved in. Kidnappings, executions, tribal warfare, all became daily reality. Hospitals ran out of supplies. Embassies fled. The streets once filled with celebration were now haunted by gunfire. We wanted freedom, said one young Libyan activist. Instead, we got warlords and chaos. A warning ignored. Before his death, Gaddafi had made a chilling prediction. If I fall, Europe will be flooded with migrants. Terrorists will use Libya as a gate to the West. At the time, Western leaders mocked it as the desperate ravings of a tyrant. But within 2 years, Libya became a hub for human trafficking. Tens of thousands of migrants crossed the Mediterranean into Europe. Boats sank. Families drowned. ISIS claimed parts of coastal Libya. Even open-air slave markets were filmed by undercover journalists in 2017. Was this better than Gaddafi? Some Libyans began to whisper. The devil you know. It's the uncomfortable question that lingers today. He was a tyrant, yes. He jailed dissidents, tortured rivals, funded terror abroad. But Libya, under Gaddafi, was a functioning state. Free education and healthcare. One of the highest literacy rates in Africa. Subsidized housing, fuel, and food. An organized, if tightly controlled, society. And now, Libya has no president. No unified government. Just warlords and ruins. A mirror to the world. The ghost of Gaddafi haunts more than just Libya. It haunts the very idea of foreign intervention. When is the world justified in toppling a dictator? What happens after the regime falls? And who is responsible when everything collapses? Because what happened in Libya was not just a civil war. It was a global failure. A dictator died, not in court, but in dirt. And the world that watched did nothing. He died in fear. But the fear didn't die with him. Please, don't shoot. Those were Muammar Gaddafi's last recorded words. A man who ruled through terror. Who threatened to turn cities into rivers of blood. Who executed dissidents on live television. In his final moments, begged for the very mercy he never gave. A tyrant's end. His body was buried in secret. No mourners. No monument. just wind blowing over the desert. But for millions, the image of Gaddafi, bloodied, broken, pleading, is seared into memory. "What did I do to you?" he asked, over and over. And for a moment, he wasn't a tyrant. He was just a man. Frightened. Alone. Human. And that, perhaps, is what made it so hard to stomach. The justice that never came. There was no trial. No final defense. No accounting for 4 decades of crimes. The victims of Gaddafi's regime, the tortured, the exiled, the families of the dead, never got their day in court. Instead, the world got a video. A violent, chaotic end. A dictator lynched in the street. For some, it was justice. For others, a stain. "We could have shown the world that we were better," said one Libyan judge years later. "Instead, we showed them that vengeance was louder than justice." Legacy in ruin. Today, Gaddafi's legacy is a paradox. He ruled like a monster, but warned of monsters to come. He terrorized his people, but kept the borders intact. He stole from his nation, but also built its infrastructure. And in death, his shadow lingers, not just in Libya, but across the entire region. Did the world create this ending? Western powers supported the uprising. NATO bombed his convoys. But no one had a plan for what came next. When Gaddafi died, Libya didn't rise. It fractured. The refugee crisis surged. Extremists filled the vacuum. And the world simply turned away. "We got rid of the dictator," said one NATO official. "But we didn't bring peace." He ruled for 42 years. He died in 42 seconds. The man who once claimed to be immortal was silenced in a storm drain. But what remains, the footage, the blood, the aftermath, speaks louder than he ever did. He died in fear. But the fear didn't die with him. If that hit you too, if the line between justice and revenge still chills you, this channel is where the hidden stories come alive. Subscribe to History Stoic Insights, where truth isn't just told, it's remembered. Share this with someone who thinks they know how history ends. And in the comments, tell us, was this justice or something darker?